Can a president unilaterally impose massive taxes on nearly everything you buy? Just days ago, actually, August 29th, 2025, a federal appeals court delivered a powerful blow to presidential power. It ruled 7-4 that former President Trump's sweeping tariffs were illegal. So according to this court, the answer to that question is a pretty resounding no.
Yeah, a very big no.
And this isn't just, some argument over trade policy. This is really a constitutional showdown. It could fundamentally redefine who controls our nation's economic future.
Absolutely. And it directly impacts your wallet. Make no mistake about that.
Right. The stakes are incredibly high. And former President Trump has already vowed an appeal to the Supreme Court, which means these controversial taxes on imports, they stay in effect, at least for now.
For now. It creates a lot of uncertainty.
So on this deep dive, we're plunging right into this huge legal and economic battle over presidential tariffs. Our mission today is, I think, pretty clear. We're going to unpack the constitutional arguments, the ones challenging the president's authority. We'll also look at the very real cost these tariffs put on American families and businesses.
Yeah, the dollars and cents impact.
Exactly. And explore what this looming Supreme Court decision could mean for you and for the economy as a whole.
That's right. And at their simplest, tariffs are just taxes levied on foreign imports. The central conflict we're looking at is how former President Trump's administration used a 1977 law. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. And they used that to impose these really widespread tariffs. The claim was an unusual or extraordinary threat justified it. But what's so interesting here, and maybe a bit surprising to some, is that critics, including many respected conservative legal scholars, argue this was a dramatic overreach.
An overreach of executive power.
Yeah, pushing the boundaries of what that law, IEPA, was ever actually intended to do.
And that reinterpretation, that's really at the heart of the legal challenge, isn't it? So we'll explore those core legal arguments, then trace the economic consequences, the ones hitting consumers and businesses directly. And finally, look ahead at that pivotal Supreme Court decision that will shape America's economic landscape, maybe for generations.
Mm-hmm. Big picture stuff.
Okay, let's start maybe by pulling back the curtain on this constitutional showdown. Who truly holds the power to tax in this country? If we look at the U.S. Constitution, how explicit is it, especially about duties, foreign commerce?
Well, the Constitution is remarkably clear on this. It's really a foundational principle. Article 1, Section 8, it explicitly grants Congress the power to collect taxes, duties, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations.
Okay, Article 1, Section 8, explicitly Congress.
Yes. It's not, a vague suggestion. It's a fundamental power reserved specifically for the legislative branch. It's really a core tenet of how our government was designed to function. It ensures that the power to tax rests with the representatives, the ones closest to the people.
Okay. So if that power is so clearly laid out for Congress, where did the Trump administration find the justification to impose these tariffs themselves?
Yeah.
You mentioned IEEPA, that 1977 law. It lets the president address unusual or extraordinary threats by regulating property importation. But the argument from critics, many with a conservative legal view, is that IEEPA just does not mention tariffs or duties.
Exactly.
So is the issue then that regulating property importation traditionally meant something much narrower, like maybe seizing assets, not imposing these huge, broad taxes?
Precisely. That is the absolute crux of the argument. Historically, IEEPA was used for things like sanctions against hostile regimes.
Right, like Iran or North Korea.
Yeah, or freezing assets of foreign powers. It was a very targeted use of executive power intended for an actual emergency. It was never really seen as a tool for broad trade taxation. The Cato Institute, for instance, a conservative think tank, has argued forcefully that IEPA was actually enacted to limit executive power.
Limit it, not expand it.
Correct. Not to expand it into areas like taxation, which are explicitly reserved for Congress.
And, it makes you wonder about the very definition of an emergency being used here.
Yeah.
When former President Trump talked about Americans being ripped off for decades, well, that doesn't really sound like an unusual or extraordinary threat that just popped up, does it?
It stretches the definition, certainly. And there was also skepticism, you might remember, around the claim that tariffs on legal imports would somehow stop illegal fentanyl.
Yeah, that connection seemed tenuous to many.
It seemed to stretch the idea of emergency beyond what many thought was its intended scope. And this is where these conservative legal doctrines come into play. Doctrines specifically designed to constrain executive power. One key concept is the major questions doctrine.
Major questions doctrine. Okay, what's that about?
This doctrine, and we've seen it gaining a lot of traction recently in Supreme Court rulings, it basically prevents the president or federal agencies from taking actions that have a really dramatic and broad impact on the U.S. economy without specific congressional authorization.
Okay, so big economic moves need Congress's explicit... Okay, that sounds important for keeping executive power in check. Can you give us an example? How has the Supreme Court used this recently?
Sure. The court famously used it to strike down the Biden administration's vaccine mandate for government contractors.
Ah, right. I remember that.
The argument was that such a significant policy needed explicit authorization from Congress. It wasn't something an agency could just decide on its own. And in the context of these tariffs, Professor Steve Vladeck notes that Trump's incredibly broad and dramatic tariffs seem to go far beyond the delegation power of Congress.
So it's about scale and impact. If it's huge, Congress needs to be involved directly.
Exactly. It's about ensuring major policy decisions, especially those with such sweeping economic consequences, come from the branch of government closest to the people, which is Congress.
Right, making sure big, impactful decisions are made by elected representatives, not, by executive fiat. What's another doctrine that comes into play here? You mentioned there were related ones.
Yeah. A closely related principle is the non-delegation doctrine.
Non-delegation, okay.
This doctrine essentially states that Congress cannot simply give away its legislative powers. It can delegate some authority, but not its core functions. And arguments against these tariffs contend that if the president really has unbounded tariff authority under IEEPA, well, that would be an unlawful delegation of Congress's power to tax.
So Congress can't just hand over a blank check on taxes to the president.
That's the argument. Both the major questions and non-delegation doctrines are really rooted in the broader constitutional principle of separation of powers, which, divides government power among three branches precisely to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, especially when we're talking about broad economic rules that affect so many Americans.
It's about maintaining that delicate balance the founders intended.
That's the core idea, yes.
So this isn't just about tariffs, then. It's really about the fundamental structure of our government. How have these legal battles, the ones fighting the tariffs, actually progressed through the courts so far?
Well, we've seen some really significant judicial decisions lately. Back in May 2025, the Court of International Trade, the CIT, they unanimously ruled that Trump had overstepped.
Unanimously, wow.
Yes, they concluded that IEPA does not delegate unbounded tariff authority to the president. And then just days ago, as you mentioned, August 29th, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit affirmed that CIT decision. It was a 7-4 ruling.
Okay, so the appeals court largely agreed.
They did. They declared most of Trump's tariffs illegal. And they really emphasized Congress's exclusive power to impose taxes like tariffs.
That's a pretty strong affirmation from the appellate court. So what's the immediate status now? Are the tariffs gone?
No, not yet. For now, the tariffs remain in effect. It's all pending that appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And with the current conservative majority on the court, the final outcome is, well, anything but certain.
Right. The legal arguments might be strong, but the judicial landscape is complex.
Very complex.
Okay, so while the courts are grappling with the letter of the law, the real-world impacts have already been hitting Americans. Households, businesses. Let's try and trace some of that economic fallout. You said earlier tariffs are taxes. Does the evidence clearly show these tariffs were paid by Americans?
Oh, absolutely. The evidence is strikingly clear, really. Studies from the 2018-2019 period show these tariffs were almost entirely passed on to U.S. consumers.
Almost entirely. Meaning higher prices for us.
Meaning higher prices for you and me at the checkout? Yes. Consider washing machines, for example. Tariffs led to an $86 increase per unit for washers and $92 for dryers.
$86 for a washer, that's significant.
It is, and it totaled over $1.5 billion in aggregate consumer costs, just for washers and dryers. This isn't theoretical. It's real money out of people's pockets. And what's particularly concerning from an economic standpoint is that this creates a regressive burden.
Meaning it hurts lower-income folks more.
Exactly. Tariffs disproportionately hurt lower and middle-income households because they spend a larger share of their income on these traded goods, clothes, electronics, everyday items.
That's a significant hit for everyday families.
Yeah.
But it's not just consumers, right? How have businesses, exporters, how have they fared under these tariffs?
They've faced major challenges, too. Increased costs are a huge factor. Look at Ford and General Motors. They faced over $1 billion in higher costs from steel and aluminum tariffs back in 2018.
$1 billion just for them.
Just for them, from those specific tariffs. It translates to roughly $700 per vehicle. That directly impacts their profitability, their competitiveness.
And beyond just the direct costs, what about the uncertainty? How does that affect businesses trying to plan ahead?
Oh, uncertainty is just a killer for business.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The National Retail Federation put it quite plainly. They said tariffs made it nearly impossible to forecast costs and manage inventories.
Nearly impossible.
Yeah. And that leads directly to things like hiring freezes, stalled investments. If a company can't predict its input costs, how can it plan for growth? Or hire new employees? Or invest in new equipment? This kind of unpredictable government action really chills economic activity.
And the problem doesn't just stop at our borders, does it? When we impose tariffs, it often triggers retaliation from other countries.
Yeah.
That hurts our own exporters.
It's the classic trade war scenario, unfortunately. When the U.S. puts tariffs on, say, China's goods, China often responds by putting tariffs on American exports, soybeans, cars, you name it. And our own U.S. exporters bore an estimated 50% of retaliatory tariffs.
How did they bear that cost?
By having to lower their prices to try and remain competitive in those foreign markets,
Right.
so their profit margins get squeezed. This is particularly devastating for sectors like agriculture.
Yeah, you hear a lot about farmers.
You do. The Department of Agriculture estimated direct export losses from retaliatory tariffs totaled $27 billion just from 2018 to 2019.
27 billion.
Wow. Yeah, heavily impacting farmers who rely on selling their crops overseas. Imagine being a farmer, working incredibly hard, and then seeing your market just shrink because of a policy decision totally beyond your control.
That's a staggering figure for such a vital industry.
Okay.
Okay, what about the broader economic consequences, like GDP, overall growth?
Well, when we look at the bigger picture, the data suggests tariffs tend to slow economic growth and job creation. We saw some direct evidence of this. A May jobs report, for instance, showed a slowdown in U.S. job growth, and it was attributed mainly to rising uncertainty from tariffs.
So the uncertainty itself slows hiring.
It does. And the Atlanta Fed's GDP Now tracker at one point projected a 1.5% shrinkage in gross domestic product, GDP, in the first quarter. Other estimates suggest a broad 10% tariff on all imports could reduce U.S. GDP by about 1.7%. These aren't small numbers. They represent real economic contraction.
It's clear the ripple effects are pretty significant and widespread. Now, one of the main arguments for tariffs was that they would reduce the trade deficit. What does the actual data tell us about that?
Well, the data tells a different story there, too. The 2018-2019 tariffs actually had no discernible impact on the relative size of the trade deficit. If anything, it slightly increased during that period.
So they didn't achieve that stated goal.
Not according to the data. And this is where it gets truly interesting and maybe counterintuitive for some listeners. Economists really, across the political spectrum, left, right, center, are almost uniquely unified in their view.
Unified about what?
Unified that tariffs, as a general policy, do not improve American welfare. In fact, they tend to lead to declines in domestic output, lower productivity, and increases in both unemployment and inequality in the long run.
It seems almost counterintuitive for some people, doesn't it? Why are economists so, well, uniquely unified against tariffs, even when they sometimes have political appeal? What's the basic economic principle?
Sure. It really boils down to the principles of comparative advantage and overall economic efficiency. Tariffs essentially act as barriers. They distort markets. They might protect certain less efficient domestic industries, but they do so at the expense of consumers who pay higher prices and other more efficient industries, especially those that rely on imports. So when you make imported goods more expensive, consumers either pay more or they buy less. You also raise costs for domestic businesses that use those imports. Think manufacturers using foreign steel or components. That makes them less competitive. Ultimately, it leads to less overall trade, less specialization based on what countries do best. And you end up with a smaller economic pie for everyone involved. It's a fundamental drag on efficiency.
And this concern, this economic viewpoint, it isn't just coming from one political corner, is it? Even within the Republican Party and the business community, we've seen significant alarm bells ringing.
Oh, absolutely. That's a key point. Senator Susan Collins from Maine, a Republican, she warned quite starkly that a 25% tariff on Canadian pulp could be devastating for a paper mill employing 510 people right there in her state. That's a direct hit on American jobs.
Right. Concrete local impact.
And Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, another Republican, reported getting a deluge of complaints from Kentucky businesses, everyone from cargo shippers and farmers to bourbon manufacturers. He also highlighted I think it was $20 billion to $30 billion in federal aid paid to farmers just to mitigate the impact of retaliatory tariffs.
Using taxpayer money to soften the blow from the tariffs themselves.
Exactly. Senator Paul basically cited this as proof of the policy's fallacy. He argued we're essentially taxing ourselves, hurting our own industries, and then using more taxpayer money to try and patch up the wounds.
And it's not just politicians expressing concern. You mentioned earlier that conservative legal organizations have actually been leading some of the lawsuits against these tariffs.
Yeah.
That seems to suggest they're prioritizing constitutional principles over maybe political loyalty in this case.
Indeed, that's quite significant. Organizations like the Liberty Justice Center and the New Civil Liberties Alliance, they've been right at the forefront of these legal challenges. For them, it seems, it's not about supporting or opposing a specific president or party. It's about upholding the constitutional separation of powers and limiting what they see as executive overreach.
Core conservative legal principles.
Exactly, which are core conservative principles. This really demonstrates that for many conservatives, these tariffs represented a fundamental departure from what they consider sound constitutional governance and free market economics.
Okay, so as this monumental legal and economic battle continues to unfold, what does this all mean for the future? What are the stakes? The Supreme Court's decision sounds absolutely pivotal.
It really will have massive implications whichever way it goes. If the Supreme Court were to uphold these tariffs, siding with the executive branch's interpretation of IEEPA, well, that would effectively validate a very broad view of executive power in emergencies.
Setting a precedent.
A major precedent. It could allow future presidents of either party to impose sweeping economic measures under the guise of national emergencies that would likely prolong economic uncertainty, international trade friction. And let's not forget, the companies that have already paid billions in these tariffs, they wouldn't get refunds. Those costs would just be permanently absorbed into the economy.
Okay, but what if the Supreme Court strikes the tariffs down? If they agree with the lower courts?
Well, that would be a very different outcome. It would strongly reassert Congress's authority over taxation and trade. It would reinforce those critical doctrines we discussed, the major questions doctrine, the non-delegation doctrine.
Strengthening Congress's role.
Yes. And that could lead to the immediate removal of the tariffs currently in place. It could open the door for businesses to potentially get refunds for tariffs paid. That could mean significant economic relief, a boost to businesses, and maybe a step towards restoring more stable international trade relations. It's a really starkly different path for the economy and for the balance of power in Washington.
So this really connects back directly to you, the listener, doesn't it? This whole deep dive shows that these debates over executive power, over obscure laws like IEEPA, they aren't just abstract legal theories.
Not at all.
They directly affect your costs at the store, maybe your job security, the overall stability of the economy you rely on. The Supreme Court's upcoming decision could, quite literally, reshape the economic rules of the game for potentially generations to come. It could fundamentally alter how much power the executive branch has over our markets.
Mm-hmm. It's that significant.
So we've navigated the complex legal battle challenging presidential tariff authority. We've tried to understand the significant economic burdens placed on consumers and businesses, and we've seen how deeply these issues resonate across the political spectrum, particularly within conservative legal and economic thought, which might surprise some.
Yes, it's a fascinating intersection of law, economics, and constitutional principles, and it really presents a profound moment for our constitutional framework. As the Supreme Court prepares to weigh in on who truly holds the power of the purse, is it Congress, as Article 1 seems to say, or can the president wield significant power here too? It makes you consider how much economic power should any single individual wield, basically with the stroke of a pen? And what does that mean for the constitutional balance our founders worked so hard to create?
A crucial question indeed. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll certainly be watching the Supreme Court case very closely, and we encourage you to do the same.